So I am recording. So that way we'll make sure we get these last classes recorded. Okay, anything else before we get started? We're all good? Okay, fantastic. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week when we were discussing the visual imagery samples, and we were sort of in the middle of discussing number 6. So if you guys can get back to sample number 6. And then we'll sort of pick up. So take a second, refresh your recollection. So this one of the samples that we looked at, this one was the longest of the samples. And some things that you guys said about the about this particular set of facts was that one thing is that Nicole had said that she really liked the footnotes, the priming. I would just make one comment about the priming is that not every footnote about priming is actually an example of priming. And so you want to be careful about that. You want to make sure that when you are footnoting your changes that you're not only indicating that you made a change, but that you've accurately assessed why you made the change. And so, for example, there's a statement here, like the first one. The first sentence is, Joanna contends she was suspended from school for 3 days and deprived of all rights and benefits of attending school, all in violation of her First and 14th Amendment rights under the U.S. Constitution. And it says priming in facts. The statement here explains that by suspending Joanna, the school violated her First Amendment rights. The footnote doesn't really add anything to the in-text statement. It doesn't explain why this is priming. To explain why it's priming, you would want to maybe tell a little bit more about what priming is and explain how this is, not just that it is priming, but how it is priming. And so you want to keep that in mind when you're drafting your footnotes, that you want to explain not just what it is, but why it is that thing, how you know it is that thing. So this isn't really an example of priming. This is an issue statement. And arguably, it doesn't even belong in the factual piece of the statement of the case. It's more appropriate for the procedural piece of the statement of the case. So the two things that are sort of missing is that it's misidentified as priming. It's not really priming. It's an issue statement. And it doesn't explain why it's priming. And so with all of the footnotes about priming that are given here, and this is true of this document, it's true of all of your facts and your argument, actually. When you identify something, you want to make sure that you've identified it accurately, and you've got to back it up. It's not enough to say that this is priming. You've got to explain what priming is and give a rationale for how this fits into that definition. Okay. Again, the footnotes that we saw in that you saw in the sample that I gave you from last summer are really, really good, and I've given you some additional samples specifically with regard to illustrative narratives, I believe, and some of the other weekly folders. Another comment that you guys made was that this one did something a little bit different than the other ones that you saw. And the other ones that you saw, there was sort of an introduction at the beginning that let us know who all the players were and what the relationships were to one another, whereas this one spread that information out throughout the facts and made it very difficult to keep up with everyone. In addition, it wasn't clear that everyone who was mentioned really needed to be mentioned by name or really needed as much detail to follow up. So that's another thing that you want to keep in mind as you draft your facts. And I think that would address to some extent the length of this. This is a really long statement of facts, considering that the facts aren't incredibly complex. And so you want to keep in mind that, you know, the page limits that you get generally in legal process tend to be about half of what you get in practice. And so the most complex litigation there is that you can appeal only gets twice as many pages as you usually get in legal process, which means that for the legal process document, you want to keep that in mind. You want to keep in mind really how long do your facts actually need to be for a problem that's not overly complex. And you want to be especially sensitive to whether or not you've included additional information that the reader really doesn't need and that really only overcomplicates things. Let's see. Any other comments about number 6 that we didn't cover last time or that I didn't summarize here? Okay. One other thing that you guys did point out was that you really liked in the 4th page of these facts, you really liked the fact that the regulation was typeset differently, and that made it very easy to kind of follow that. And you made that comment about several of the statements of the case or statements of facts, that you really liked it when the author took a regulation or some sort of lengthy text and set it off in a block quote. Remember that if you're going to set something off in a block quote, it's got to be single-spaced and double indented, meaning indented on both sides. Okay. Any other comments on this one before we move on to number 7?
Professor?
Yeah?
What did you say it has to be double indented? My internet cut out.
Anytime you block quote, and if you're not sure how to format a block quote, or if you don't remember what I said about a block quote, just look up block quotation in the index to the Blue Book, and it tells you exactly how to format it. Okay, so sample 7. Looking at sort of the questions that we were, hold on. Here are my, hold on. I'm getting some background noise out of somebody's. There we go. I got it. Okay. Oh, no, it's back again. Nicole, can you mute? There you go. Okay. So looking again at sample 7, the questions that we were asking, remember, was the first one was the visual imagery technique, either the significant moment or the obtuse object, used subtly and naturally? If so, how? And if instead you felt yourself resisting, where was the resistance? So what are your thoughts about 7? Yeah, Loretta.
I really liked this one. I didn't resist it because I felt like it was just natural what he or she was telling me in the text.
Mm-hmm.
And the footnotes, like you had said, explain why she's using that.
Okay.
And why she thinks it's priming or foreshadowing or whatever that is.
Okay.
I felt it was very clear, and I could follow it, and I could put myself into that situation.
Okay, fantastic. Rayanne?
So this thing keeps on disappearing on me. Okay. Number 7, I actually felt that was the best one that I read. A lot of the problems that I had with the other ones is I couldn't figure out how it really related to different aspects of the class that we've been learning about. And I know you had mentioned schema and the obtuse object, and I felt like this person definitely put it all together in a framework that really, if you didn't understand where they were going with the footnotes, it made sense. They explained themselves. And it didn't seem like it was too much of an explanation. It felt like it was just right. and it wasn't too, it just wasn't too much to hear from. It just was, I felt like it was one of the best. It was one of my favorites.
Okay, great. Nikki?
I agree with what the both of them said, and this one I really liked as well. Not only with the footnotes being really like explaining it well and like able to follow what was going on, but I thought that the author made a very conscious choice of the words that they used by like beloved son and how he begged the officers, just like the choice of words. I felt like it was really, like I was falling for it and I was like, oh my God, you know, like it was appealing to my emotions. So I think that it was a good choice of words.
Okay. Lorraine?
The only thing that I didn't understand is, well, not understand, I understood it. It was very clear, very clear. When I put a note, and again, it was last week, but I put a note on 4, the priming technique. I said, why couldn't it be that they were bringing him to a soup kitchen to help the poor? Why was it that it was all gloom and doom? You know, I mean, they were saying he was, you know, mommy and daddy and all this other stuff. Well, put him to work then. I don't know. I mean, I guess you have to take it in consideration that you think, oh, he's being stopped and something bad's going to happen and blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, why couldn't they bring him to a soup kitchen instead of wherever else they brought him?
I'm not entirely sure I understand you. You're saying that comparing 4 and 7?
No, I'm not comparing 4. I'm saying footnote 4.
Oh, footnote 4. Okay.
Yeah, the priming technique, teaching him a lesson because those words will invoke certain stored images in the reader's mind. Most readers will associate teaching a lesson with violence or a beating. And I'm like, well, why couldn't they be bringing him to a soup kitchen?
I see what you mean. Yeah, and it's funny because the author specifically considers that and says this is a calculated risk, because some readers may bring forward different images for teaching him a lesson, which is exactly what you did. You had a different image for that.
Right, I see it now. Yeah, I guess I missed it before. I see it now.
Yeah. So when the reader accesses the schema of teaching him a lesson, it will prepare the reader to accept my theory that the officers are figures of authority who intended to cause grave harm to Billy. And so what you're saying is that you agree that the author did sort of miss the mark on that schema use. But, you know, my postscript to that would be, but the author acknowledges that that's a gamble, that might not work. And so this is a great example of one where if you just said, oh, this is an example of using schema for priming and just left it at that, you might lose points for that, because I, like Lorraine, might look at that and go, teaching him a lesson is kind of, you know, I'm not sure I agree that is the same, because I agree, I don't know that I would associate it with brutality, but I might associate it with something unpleasant that the person wouldn't like. And that would serve as a deterrent. Like, I would see it that way. I don't know I would go as far as brutality. And so I agree with you, but you would pick up the points again. You would pick some, if not all of those points back up by acknowledging that this is a risk. Everybody may not have the same schema I do for teaching someone a lesson. And so it could be that brutality goes too far. And so this footnote does a great job of identifying the technique, backing up the identification with why it is, and then sort of hedging the bets by saying, here's why, if this doesn't work, here's why I think it might not work. And that demonstrates that you understand the technique at a much deeper level than someone who just says this is schema. Okay, so that's what I'm looking for. You can miss the mark. I mean, not a ton, but you can miss the mark a little bit and completely redeem it with an acknowledgement. So that's, you want to share that. You want to share that thought process that you're going through. What I'm more concerned about than anything is that you demonstrate that you did that you understand the technique and that you evaluated your options and you did that in a way that reflects an understanding of each of the techniques, whether or not it was ultimately 100% successful. Now, here's what I want to caution you against. It's tempting when you run across something like this to go, okay, so on every footnote then, I'm just going to say, if it goes wrong for this reason. Don't do that, because some of the techniques you're going to feel pretty good about, you know, and by saying, oh, if it goes wrong, let me put it this way. The best way to get an A in any class in law school is not to try to get an A in any class in law school. It's to try to perform the task to the best of your ability and let the A be the byproduct. And so the same is true here. Use these techniques and identify these techniques to the best of your ability. Let the grade be a byproduct. Don't try to, like there's no formula for the A other than to use these techniques to the best of your ability. So this, I agree with all of you who said that this reflects a nice, sophisticated understanding of the techniques that we're dealing with, and expresses that understanding in a way that, to me, as somebody who's going to assess them, indicates that the person was really trying to have a conversation about the techniques rather than trying to get the A. Okay, Dominic. You're still, for some reason, you're still mute. Are your speakers maybe low? Turned down low? I mean, is your mic turned down low?
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yep.
So, well, this was actually one of my favorites out of the group, because I can literally picture the entire thing playing out in my head, almost like a little film.
Yeah.
Because you have everything is just, it's placed so purposefully, and like everyone else said, we're doing that, and the use of the footnotes kind of gives you some back context to everything as well. So it makes it's already easy to understand. It makes it even easier because it just gives you that kind of, that little extra. It's kind of like when you're watching a show and you don't know what really happened before. It's kind of giving you everything so you really understand what the whole thing is about.
Yeah, I think that's a very insightful comment. I think that I like that kind of analogy that you give about sort of the rest of the story. Like, okay, so here's the real context, is that you get a very clear, significant moment, but the footnotes really explain to you why it works. Here's why this is persuasive. And that's what you want your footnotes to do. You want them to assess your own techniques so that I not only see that I'm reading something persuasive, but the footnotes analyze for me why it worked. And they sort of give me the rest of the story. Here's why you felt like this was persuasive. I think this did a really fantastic job. And keep in mind, again, for the examples that we saw that had the footnotes, there were a lot of footnotes on those, and you were only footnoting one technique, which is the visual imagery and the priming for visual imagery. So you're going to have a lot of footnotes as you go through this. So any questions about priming and visual imagery before we move on? Dominic, did you have one?
So when we go through actual appellate brief,
Yep.
is each section having its own thing? Like this section's going to only be visual imagery, or are we going to kind of apply everything to all of the sections?
Everything to every section.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it'll be a full-blown analysis of the document using what you've learned throughout the semester. Yeah. And you guys are already discovering you will never write the same way again. You just won't. After you've done this much analysis of a single document, you will never write the same way again. It will change forever how you look at writing. Okay, so the next thing we want to move on to then is more logos and narrativity in writing. And what we're going to talk about in particular is are two main ideas. The first main idea that we're going to talk about tonight. And hold on, let me look at the syllabus real fast. I think what I'm going to do is bump everything because we're going to have that makeup on the 10th. So if you guys will make some notes real quick. On July the 5th, we will finish up this topic of logos and pathos together. So we'll do that tonight and on the 5th. On the 6th and the class on the 10th, we will talk about metaphor, creating metaphors. And what I'm going to try to do is do that in a way that you guys do the group work on the 6th associated with that. So we've got everybody here. And then produce something that we can give feedback on the 10th so that we're not doing group work when we've only got, when we haven't got our full group with us. So metaphor is going to be the 6th and the 10th, and then we'll be back on schedule that last week for July 11th and 13th. Okay. Okay. So tonight and next, and then July the 5th, we're going to be talking about logos and pathos together. Okay. So the general concept of logos and pathos together is that you organize things in a way that prepares your reader to accept them. Okay. So that happens in two ways. One is the organization of your story, right? The organization of your narrative in the statement of facts. And we're going to talk about that first. And then the second thing is the organization of, or the relationship and organization of your facts to your argument. And so after we have talked about, sort of storytelling techniques, we're going to talk about on next Tuesday, the 5th, we will talk about priming your argument with your facts. And specifically, we're going to look at Shuttlesworth and Walker. And so let me tell you now what I'd like you to read, because I've talked about Shuttlesworth and Walker before. I posted Shuttlesworth and Walker online. What I would like you to read of Shuttlesworth, what is that right? Sorry, Walker. What I would like you to read in Walker is from the beginning through to, hold on. Yeah, so I want you to read through to, it's head note number 8 in the document. And the paragraph starts with, on the handout that you have, it's the 1, 2, 3, it's the 4th page. You're going to stop right before you see the bracketed 8. Okay, and so that paragraph starts with the breadth and vagueness of the injunction. You're not going to read that paragraph or anything after it. So you're just going to read the first, basically the first 4 pages of the opinion. And then for Shuttlesworth, hold on. For Shuttlesworth, you're going to start at the beginning. Hold on. Okay. So in Shuttlesworth, you're going to read from the beginning again down to about the middle of page 4. And I mean like the literal physical pages. So you're going to read down to you're going to read through the first full paragraph of page 4. It's bracketed number 14. There's a paragraph, the start of the paragraph, that's the first paragraph you won't read, is in Cox, the court found that control of the streets had not been exerted unconstitutionally. So in Cox is what starts the first paragraph that you won't read. Okay? So you're going to read Shuttlesworth down to through the first full paragraph of page 4. So about the first 4 pages of both of those opinions to prepare for class next Tuesday, where we're going to talk about priming. And the one question you want to keep in mind as you read is, or let me give you 3 questions. The first question is, what is the legal theory? The second question is, what is the factual theory? And the third question is, how do the facts prime the analysis? Okay, so again, first 4 pages of Shuttlesworth and Walker. The questions are, what is the legal theory of each one? What is the factual theory of each one? And in each case, how do the facts prime the analysis? And by priming, we mean prepare the reader to accept. Because remember, what we're trying to do with priming, whether it's whether it's significant moments, whether it's foreshadowing, no matter what kind of priming we're doing, the reason that we do the priming is to lower the reader's resistance to information. And so you want to look at, what is it about the facts that prime the analysis? Okay. And then I'll also give you some examples from the OJ case to help you understand that as well. Okay. But tonight we're focusing just on storytelling within the fact section, within the narrative section. And so the question is, how do we use just the raw factual material that we have to create a narrative that will be compelling? And so the reason that this topic is logos and pathos together is that your facts have to be a compelling narrative so that the judge wants to rule in your favor. The judge has got to want to rule in your favor, because as much as we like to think of judges as completely neutral, they are human beings. And when surveyed over and over and over, judges say what compels us toward a conclusion is that we want to do the right thing. We want to feel like we've done justice, not that we've just come up with the right logical answer, okay? And so pathos is incredibly important. But another thing that we've learned so far is that when the attempt to persuade is obvious, it fails. And so telling the story is a very subtle craft. And the techniques that you've learned so far about logos, pathos, and ethos have been techniques that happen sort of all behind the scenes. They happen in the preparation and the organization of your document and in the selection of the language. They're not overt things. You don't tell the reader, I am credible and this is a logical, emotionally persuasive document. You show the reader that. You create that kind of document, let the reader draw that conclusion. So the same is true of the facts. You can't come in hard and heavy on the facts and expect that to work. And so that's why one of the techniques, one of the first factual techniques that we started with was identifying a significant moment. What is organizationally a moment that we can pivot the facts around, that we can prime and lead up to, and then have the reader focus on what moment is going to make the reader most sympathetic toward the client's cause or the client's position. And so now we're going to talk about organizing the facts as a whole. What story are we going to tell using the facts that we have? And there are always multiple stories that you can tell. I've told you guys a little bit about the article that I'm writing about post-Katrina speedy trial violations. And there are any number of legal issues that come out after a weather disaster. There are insurance issues, there are construction issues, there are fraud in construction issues, there are insurance fraud issues, there are criminal procedure issues, there are family law issues. A whole host of issues comes up after a disaster. And in all of those cases, all of the parties are trying to tell the story of the disaster in a way that supports their ultimate position. So when you're talking about, just the simple question of what happened? What happened in Katrina? You get a lot of different answers. And with all of the facts available and with 2020 hindsight, there's plenty of evidence to tell a number of stories. You could marshal all those facts together and tell a story about a government that didn't adequately respond to warnings. So it's the government's fault. You could talk about shoddy engineering on the levee system. That's the Army Corps of Engineers' fault. You can talk about individual failure to heed warnings to leave. That's individual responsibility. That's an individual's fault. You can talk about a social service system or a social safety net system that failed to leave citizens with sufficient resources to leave. And so now that's a human services problem. So you can tell the story any number of ways, depending on where you're, what your position is legally. So to do that, just as we've looked to some other disciplines for different aspects of persuasion, we look to literature to help us understand how it is that we craft a story. What are the elements of a story? What is the arc of a story? And that's what these two articles help us understand, is how is it that we craft a story and how do we apply that in the legal context? So the first question I want to ask, and I'll take volunteers, is I'd like somebody to sort of just summarize for us the Fiction 101 article. Basically, what is the advice in the Fiction 101 article? Yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
I'll take a shot at it. They talked about the elements of a story, and they spoke about that there has to be character, conflict, and resolution. The character must have goals, and or they're creating a conflict. The conflict is, they classified a bunch of different conflicts. One that came out to me was man versus man, or I think the other one was like man versus society, and there's a list of others. And then there should be a wrap-up, the resolution, which is basically what I think is where we're kind of saying, okay, well, here are the characters, here's the conflict, here's how you should decide the case. They also talked about organization, the order, disorder. Oh, no, yeah, so it's order, disorder, chaos, and reorder. And I think they were talking about how that was like Aristotle's put that together. If I remember correctly. And so the order and disorder, they set the context, introduced the clients describing what happens, the disruption and the chaos, and how that disruption affected the chaos or affected the client, and then reordering that in such a way that the advocate can say, hey, this is how you fix the issue. Then they also discussed highlighting like a point of view. You got to put yourself in the point of view of the reader so they could understand the concepts.
Okay, that's fantastic. Does anybody have anything to add? Anything that really stood out to you in the Fiction 101 article? Yeah, Nikki?
Ryan pretty much summed it up. He gave a really good synopsis. But one thing that I did notice is that I don't think I'm confusing the articles, but I think that they said that this one, it was important to make your character come to life, so there's actually a connection between the reader and the author. And that kind of stuck out because I think that's true.
Okay, fantastic. And Marilyn?
I like the part where they talk about introducing your client first before jumping into any kind of major narrative. That hasn't always occurred to me. Like, you know, I was thinking, okay, just jump into it and tell them all about the conflict. That would work better. But I see now that if you don't introduce them and so they can get to know the person, the whole thing can fall apart.
Right. And so going back to the visual imagery samples that we looked at and looking at it in the context of this article, the sixth one, the first one that we looked at tonight, remember that some of you responded that it was hard to keep up with who everybody was. You didn't know who the players were, and that you sort of got that information throughout rather than front-loaded. And so you weren't really sure where everything was going. That's a problem of not introducing the characters before you jump into the conflict. And so, in fact, all of the things, I would say pretty much all of the things that we talked about with regard to those visual imagery samples, the things that you guys had trouble with as far as understanding, really all get resolved sort of with this material. This material gives you the solutions to solving all of those organizational problems. Rayanne?
I was I felt like both articles fell hand in hand with each other. Was the Fiction 101 and the other article about Harry Potter and the Ruby Slippers article. I'm personally a huge Harry Potter fan, so I think when I saw the Fiction 101 article, and I think Ryan did a really well job explaining it, is that you really have to get to know the characters, and as soon as you get to know the characters in the story, you fall in love. Well, I guess if it's a case, you can't really fall in love with it, but you can understand their perspectives, you can understand their journey and their hardship, and you want to give them the hero-esque perspective. And like coming from my type of appellate brief where my guy is technically the thief in the situation, I had to kind of explain it in the hero perspective, like it's like Lord Voldemort being the good guy. So right. I kind of liked how they both blended, but yeah, that was just my perspective on it too.
Yeah. Randy?
I think for me, what I learned from the articles also was the fact that you could draw the actual judge or the jury into your story. If you encourage the judge or the jury to be the hero, the one deciding the case and saving your client, or actually, seeking justice for your client, that didn't really, I didn't think about that, but to me, that was very important.
Yeah, and it's easy for us as lawyers to think, well, we're the hero of the story. We're the advocate. We're the one we are championing our client's cause. But actually, we are most effective when we are just the messenger, when we really take a sophisticated view about crafting the message and we just present it and we turn it over to the judge or the jury. And in fact, there's a story. Have you guys heard the story about Jerry Spence and the bird in your hands? Have you guys heard that one? Not a lot of you. Okay. So Jerry Spence has this way that he liked to end criminal trials where he would sometimes he would do this instead of any kind of closing. He wouldn't talk about the facts or anything. He would say, I've done what I could do. I have shown you the problem with the prosecution's case. I have shown you who my client is. And then he tells a story about this wise old man and a young man, and the young man comes to the old man and says, "I have a bird in my hands. Can you guess whether it's alive or dead?" And the old man says to him, "Son, I know that you have a bird in your hands. If I say that the bird is alive, you will crush the bird and then open your hands to reveal a dead bird, that I was wrong. If I say that the bird is dead, you will open your hands and the bird dramatically will fly away, proving me wrong. And he said, so son, you asked me whether the bird is alive or dead, and I tell you, the bird is in your hands. And he just leaves it with that. And so that is the reason that story is so fantastic and it works so well is because it taps the jury on the shoulder. It doesn't slap them in the face with it. It just taps the jury on the shoulder and says, okay, I'm the storyteller. I've brought you thus far. What is the ending? You tell me what the ending is. And so that's a different role for us than we're used to. In law school, we're taught that we are the center of the story, but really we are most effective as storytellers and as people who place the judges and the jurors in the story. Now, one thing that's different between a trial and an appeal is that at the trial, we hand it over without any kind of resolution. This is where we are. What is the answer? Who was right and who was wrong? And the jury or the judge, if it's a bench trial, gets to tell us. At the appellate level, and you see this with the structure of an appellate brief, at the appellate level, the trial court becomes part of the story. And what you have to be really delicate with is when you have to tell the appellate court that part of what went wrong is that the trial court did not behave. The trial court did not end the story correctly, and so now this court has got to end the story correctly. This court has got to take on the role of giving us the real correct answer, and that's tricky to do without casting the court in a negative role. You don't ever want to cast a court in a negative role, and so at the appellate level, you have a more complete story. You have an answer. You have an end to the story. And then you've got to go to the appellate court and explain why you should have a different ending to the story. Why is it that the story should have a different ending, or why is it that we should have the same ending? So yeah, I think that point is, I think that's a really important point, Randy, about, that you fold in the judge or the jury into the story and let them become part of it. It's sort of like what is it? The murder mystery dinners. It's kind of like that, where you're presented with a scenario and then you get to sort of act out the end. That's what you do with the court. Rayanne?
Actually, to add on to that, the attorney that I'm interning for this summer, he actually writes the decisions for one of the judges, and he has told me the best way to relay a story is, the best way to relay a decision is to tell a story. And for him, the best way to relay a decision is to write it for the losing party. So that's how he incorporates reading, giving it to the other attorneys and to possible judges who might read it one day. So they read it from the perspective of the person that's the losing party, because the losing party is going to be the one that picks everything up and say, well, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. So that's his perspective. Yeah. And that's actually, a judge gave him that advice. And as we're talking about this and how we have to incorporate the judge and the jury, it was something interesting that I thought he could have, he does as well. So
he writes the shadow story. He writes not really the shadow story, but he writes the counter story first so that he knows how to construct the actual opinion?
Yeah, he kind of outlines everything and then makes it so that for the person that is going to be the most unhappy understands why he made the decision, why the judge made the decision that she made, right, and puts it in a very delicate way so that way they can understand it and they can take it step by step. So it's storytelling in a different version.
Yeah, so he writes things out so that he fully considers what this is going to look like to the losing party, and then drafts his opinion so that he addresses all of those objections, all of those issues. Yeah, that's a great idea. It's a fantastic idea. That's great. It takes a lot of discipline to make yourself do that, and it's fantastic when you can, when you understand the value of that process. That's really important. Who would like to sum up for us the Harry Potter and the Ruby Slippers article? Yeah, Marilyn.
I'll try it.
Okay.
It talks about how to use a metaphoric hero as a way of telling your client's story, as a journey to transform himself into something better, and just transform society into something better as well. And how to go about doing that through the different elements of a story, which are also the same elements as a lawsuit, which yeah.
Okay. Joan, what do you want to add to that?
I like that I like most of the whole article that every hero has flaws and that can help you.
Right.
You kind of think about heroes as the perfect person, and they don't have to be, and they probably don't want to be the perfect person because they become more sympathetic if they have flaws that they're trying to overcome. I thought that was an important part of the article.
It is, and it is because you have to think about, particularly when you're presenting a case to a jury. And what we want to remember is these persuasion techniques. These don't just apply, even though you're dealing with an appellate document. These don't just apply on appeal. They apply at trial when you're dealing with the judge, at trial when you're dealing with the jury. They have to do with how you tell your story in a negotiation. How do you explain what it is that you want and why you think you should get it? So all of this applies in every single context, whether it's an adversarial resolution process or a non-adversarial resolution process. It all applies across the board. And we tend to like, jurors in particular, tend to like the heroes to be flawless, but it doesn't take much to remind them that that's not actually what we're used to. That, in the Shakespearean sense, what separates tragedy from comedy is whether the hero is able to overcome his fatal flaw. If the hero is undone by his fatal flaw, that is by definition a tragedy. If the hero overcomes his fatal flaw, that is by definition a comedy. And so, Shakespeare didn't write around people's flaws. He let the flaw direct the outcome. And so we have to consider that also, that our heroes are going to have flaws, and that's okay. That's fine. Nikki?
I was just going to add on what John was saying, how the article was interesting, how it said that it's not necessarily someone who you think is going to be a villain is, and it could be a guardian and all those other characters that they were giving the mythical characters or whatever, but it was very coinciding with the other article how it was saying that the three most important things is learning who your characters are, which is I took to be essentially like the most important thing, because if you misidentify your character when you're telling the story, it could change the way someone interprets it. And then, which goes back to what you were saying earlier in the lesson about whose point of view are you going to tell this from? Because it matters. Is it the government? Is it the person that happened? So, and the other note that I wrote down here is make sure you know who your protagonist is.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point that kind of flows into the next thing that we want to talk about, which is that you want to think, these two articles give us a way to organize our thinking about our statement of facts. It gives us some sort of elements that we need to sort of satisfy and an organization that we need to think about. The significant moment, it doesn't necessarily, if you're talking about the arc of the story, the significant moment doesn't have to be the climax. A significant moment could be earlier, it could be later, so it doesn't necessarily have to be the climax, but significant moment fits in there as one of the elements of your story. It's a moment that you really want to focus on. So the pieces that you want to come up with are with regard to, and Ryan told us at the beginning that Fiction 101 tells us that we need character, conflict, and resolution, that those are the three things we start with. And so that's what you want to start thinking about with regard to your with your particular set of facts. You want to think about character, conflict, and resolution. With regard to character, you need a protagonist and an antagonist. The protagonist is who we're going to root for. The antagonist is who we don't like. What Marilyn pointed out was that you want to tell the story starting with the perspective of the protagonist. Because the first person that we're introduced to, we are trained as readers, as movie watchers, we are trained that the first person is usually somebody that we're supposed to like, that's who we're supposed to relate to. And so when we are introduced to someone, we generally start about that task of relating to them. We start finding things to like about them, just sort of instinctively. So you want to think about that with the protagonist. You want to start with the protagonist perspective. And then you want to choose an antagonist. Now, it seems like law would make this a really easy task. You got a plaintiff, you got a defendant. You got a prosecutor, you got a defendant. There's your protagonist, there's your antagonist, all done. But it's not that easy because as Nikki pointed out about the Harry Potter article, there are more roles than just protagonist and antagonist. And it could be that a witness is actually your protagonist, or a witness is actually your antagonist, or somebody who is not directly involved in the litigation is your protagonist or your antagonist. Or it could be that your protagonist isn't even a person, that your protagonist is a value or an institution. So the example I gave you was about Katrina, that, there are a lot of things that you could say went wrong. You could say that, for example, you could say that the storm, which is, going to be nature or God, that the storm is the antagonist and the protagonist is, let's say, a criminal defendant in the case of my speedy trial cases. That the protagonist is the criminal defendant and the antagonist is the storm, and that the defendant is making these speedy trial claims and telling the court, you need to resolve this problem. And the court gets to stand back and say, I can't solve your problem for you. This is a man versus nature problem. This isn't even a court system problem. The court system didn't cause the storm. The court system couldn't have prevented the storm. Therefore, the time you spent in jail doesn't count against the speedy trial clock because it wasn't the government's fault. The government wasn't the antagonist here. The storm was the antagonist. And that's how the courts told that story. They told it as defendant versus storm. There are other ways you could tell that story. You could tell that story as government versus individual. So that's man versus institution, where the antagonist is the government, the state government as a whole, and all of, you could identify different things as the fault of the government. Not responding to the Hurricane Pam exercise, not dealing with the fact that the Corps of Engineers didn't build the levees to appropriate specifications, not having a backup plan for what to do with prisoners in the case of a hurricane in the Gulf Coast. And so you could have that, be this behemoth institution against this little person, but all of the problems are, the government's fault. So the government is the antagonist. You could have the government versus the storm. So you could cast it a lot of different ways. It's not just plaintiff versus defendant. So you want to think about that. Those of you who have the copyright problem, and again, I've told you how desperately I hated that problem. I hated it so bad. But it is rife with possibilities for protagonists and antagonists. Obviously, the easiest protagonists and antagonists are Silverman and Rafel, plaintiff and defendant, right? But if you're arguing that the problem is that the registration statute is such that his receipt doesn't constitute registration, that he was supposed to wait for an answer, then you don't want to cast, you don't want to cast Rafel as the antagonist. You want to say, I'm not the antagonist. The antagonist is the legislature. The legislature wrote this crap legislation that the courts can't do anything about. That's the problem. Maybe you could argue that, you can argue that Silverman is the antagonist in that he didn't wait for his piece of paper. But the problem with that is you're already accused of stealing. Rifle's already accused of stealing Silverman's work. And so you may not want to pile on and say, and he didn't do this thing right. You may instead want to say, listen, we're sympathetic to Rifle. We're sympathetic to Silverman. We're really sympathetic to him. It just so happens that that's not who the problem is the legislature, really, not really Silverman. So there are different ways that you can cast those facts. You can have different roles. A police officer in a criminal case can be a witness, can be a guardian, can be a mentor, can be an antagonist, can be a protagonist. What role people fulfill depends on how you tell the story. Okay, so it depends on organizationally how you tell the story. Remember, the persuasion has to be subtle. So this has got to happen it's all got to be undercurrent. It can't be right over the surface. So you're going to start with who you decide your protagonist is, and that's how you're going to signal to the reader, this is who you should sympathize with. Because you're going to introduce that person or that entity or that value first. And so with regard to the order, disorder, chaos, reorder, the protagonist should be in a state of order, and then the entry of the antagonist should introduce disorder and ultimately chaos. And then the goal is for the reorder to be suggested by you in the argument. Here's how you reorder these things. Here's how you fix it. Okay. With regard to conflict, we just talked about that, or I just explained that, where conflict is, are the protagonist and antagonist just going to be the people? Are they going to be institution? What kind of conflict are you going to set up? So your character and your conflict are really closely tied to one another. And then the Ruby Slippers, the Harry Potter and the Ruby Slippers article gives you some tools, gives you some roles for others to play. Now, if you have individuals who are involved but don't have a role to play in the hero's arc, in the hero's journey, that person's not important. Okay? And so there are a lot of legally relevant facts that involve people that aren't directly related, where you can talk about the facts without identifying the people. Okay? So for example, in that, and I'm just using this example not to pick on it, but because it provides a nice example of this. In example, the sample 6 that we looked at, the mistress. It's somewhat important that there was a mistress. It's not hugely important. It's somewhat important that there was a mistress. It's completely unimportant who the mistress is, right? So she doesn't have a role in the hero's journey. There's not a place in the story organization that she fits. So you just leave her out. You can say that he had a mistress, but it doesn't matter who, So this helps you organize. It helps you decide what's important, what role they're going to play, and how to organize this information. Okay. Any questions before we move on? Yeah, Marilyn.
Can you elaborate a little bit? Both articles talk about that you have to tell whether lawsuit or proceedings fit in the client's goals. Like it's not the end all be all of the life.
Right.
How do you do that?
So with let's assume a relatively simple case where you're casting your client as the protagonist. So what you have is the client has a goal, meaning what is it that the client wants out of life before this all happened? And so what was the client trying to do or trying to be when this happened? The goal, like the obvious goal is to make the problem go away, right? But obviously she means for you to go deeper than that. So what is it that the client wanted out of life, out of a situation, out of a relationship before the antagonist introduced the disorder or the chaos? And how will this lawsuit either help restore that person so they can pursue their goal, or how will the lawsuit fulfill the goal, or how does the lawsuit thwart the goal? So that's what she means by how does the lawsuit fit into the goal? Like, does the lawsuit further the goal? Does the lawsuit just restore them to a position where they can then go about their way toward the goal? Is the lawsuit the goal? Or is the lawsuit an impediment to the goal? So that's what she means. Other questions? Okay. So what I'd like you to do is get into your group. So I'm going to send you into your rooms. And I'd like you to talk about how you might, what your thoughts are on who your protagonist is, who your antagonist is, and what your conflict is. And probably, because even though some of you have the same problem, some of you have different sides of the problem, and even people who have the same problem on the same side are not necessarily going to tell the same story. There's so much you can do with these facts that you may have different ideas about the story. So what I'd like you to do is, as you get in your groups, first go around and person by person tell who you think your protagonist should be, who you think your antagonist should be, and what your conflict is, and then get some feedback from the people in your group about whether that's compelling or whether they have other ideas about that. If you have time, you can also talk about what your protagonist's goals might be, and what does resolution or reorder look like? And so that gives you a sense of how the lawsuit plays into the goal. So what does restoration look like if the client gets what you're asking the court for? Okay. Okie doke. Okay, so all your rooms are open. You guys done?
Yeah.
Awesome. Did you guys have any questions?
Well, we had a question on the syllabus. I know we have an assignment that's due. It's 10% of our grade. We were wondering, is that going to be pushed back also, or are we still on schedule for that?
That's a good question. Let me look. I imagine, hold on. Man, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't want to push it too far because I want to be able to get you feedback, you know, in time for it to do some good for you before your brief gets due. So probably like sometime in the next couple of days, I'll get you feedback on the argument section, the piece of the argument section that you sent me. Although at this point, like I know that you're interested in the grade that you got, the feedback that you get at this point shouldn't surprise you very much because we've talked a lot more about the annotations and you have a much better, idea of what you're looking at. So yeah, let me do this. Let's have this due July 11th, which is the following Monday. Because we just need to get through the information that we'll cover on Tuesday. So that will give you pretty much a week to incorporate all that information and get that in. So that Monday, I'm going to say 9 a.m. And that way I can look at them during the day and hopefully even get them back to you the same day. So yeah, so we'll say July 11th at 9 a.m. and I'll post that and make sure that goes out to everybody so they all know. Hey guys.
Hello.
So Randy just asked a brilliant question, which is the statement of facts section and the annotated facts that are due July the 6th. He asked if that would be pushed. And so I'm going to push that to July the 11th at 9 a.m. So that'll give you a little bit of extra time to do that. Even like beyond what you would need to take into account the makeup class. So it's going to be due the 11th at 9 a.m. And the reason I'm doing 9 a.m., I know that's going to be a push for people who aren't at the class. They're going to have to watch the class, at some point during that day or evening. No, because the July 10th class won't have anything to do with that statement of fact. We'll finish all of that material by the 5th, so that'll be fine. So it'll be due July 11th, 9 a.m. The reason I'm doing 9 a.m. is so that I can spend that day reviewing them and turning them around so that you have them pretty quickly, because then your final product is due pretty quickly after that, within a week or so. Your argument sections that you guys turned in with the annotations, I'll return those to you probably end of the week, I'm thinking. If I can get tomorrow, if I can get a block of time tomorrow, I'll get them back to you tomorrow. Orion, you had another question?
Yes, in our brief, we have statement of the case and statement of the facts. What do you actually, you want both? What do you want, one or the other?
No. Did your brief have both?
Yes.
Okay. So you had a statement of the case, which was your procedural history. Is that correct?
Sure, I guess. I don't know.
Okay. So generally, the federal rules, before they were changed a few years ago, the federal rules called for a statement of the case and a statement of the facts. And so even when problems were set in fictional jurisdictions, sometimes they use the federal rules. So if you have a statement of the case and a statement of the facts,
I do, yeah.
okay, so include both of those. One is procedural history, one is factual history. Okay. If you have just a statement of the case and not a statement of facts, the federal rules say that both of those things should be included within your statement of the case, both the facts and the procedure. So if you're under old federal rules or either under some of the state rules, you may have a procedural section, a procedural fact section, and a case fact section. I want both of them, whether they're all in statement of case or whether they're in both. I think before I had said just do the case facts and don't worry about the procedural facts, because you all have it under different rules. And some of you have those things bundled together. I think it's more fair to have everybody turn in all the procedural facts and everybody turn in all the case facts. So I want procedural facts and case facts, whether they're in separate sections or the same section. Whatever you did for your brief is fine, just as long as I've got both. Hold on. Okay, so the other thing is okay, so the other question I was asked, and for those who've already heard this information a couple times, you're free to go. I'm not going to tell you anything new. I'm going to just keep saying this over and over again. The due date for the annotated statement of facts, which is just your facts. It doesn't have to be procedural history. If you include procedural history, that's fine, but it doesn't have to be. Just your statement of facts. The annotated statement of facts is going to be due not July the 6th, but it's going to be due July the 11th at 9 a.m. to give you time to incorporate the information from the July 5th class. Okay, so the two changes I've made are that the due date goes from July 6th to July 11th at 9 a.m. It only needs to be just your facts. In your final document, I want procedural facts and case facts, because what I'm discovering is that some of you have them in separate sections and some of you have them in the same section. So I want procedural and case facts. And that's it. You're free to go. Yeah, Loretta.
That final document is due after the class is over?
Yes, it is due finals week. Let me see. I believe it's July 18th. July 18th, 10 a.m. via Twin.
Okay.
Yeah. Joan?
So the final document, is that the entire case, the entire paper we wrote for process 2, or is it just the procedural and the facts?
No. That's the whole document.
The whole thing.
All of the sections that I told you guys that you need to include.
Okay.
That's what's due July 18th. What's due July 11th, for those of you who just came in a second ago, I've changed two things. The due date for the facts, the annotated facts, is July the 11th at 9 a.m. rather than July the 6th. And that's to give you time to incorporate the material from July the 5th. And that is just your facts section. That's just the case facts. If you want to include procedure, that's fine, but you don't have to include the procedural facts. I'm just looking for the case facts. For the final document, I want both your procedural facts and your case facts. Some of you have all that in one section. Some of you have it in two different sections. And so to avoid confusion, I just want everybody to submit procedural facts and case facts, whichever sections they're in.
Thank you.
And that's it. If you guys don't have any questions, you're free to go.
Thank you.
Hey, Ken.
Hey, can you just give me a quick rundown of each section that we do need in the final document real quick?
Yes. Yes. I got your email. I just didn't have time to respond to it.
Yeah, I figured it's fine.
Okay, so you're going to need hold on. Okay, so you need the cover page, the table of contents, the table of authorities, the summary of argument, the procedural facts and the case facts, whatever sections those are in, and the argument section.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.